So, if there's one company that is likely to be affected by tariffs and what's happening with President Trump, it's probably GameStop. GameStop is a retailer. They import a lot of stuff to sell to the American public, uh, internationally as well. So, maybe some of their international operations might be affected less, but at least since a majority of their sales or a bulk of their sales comes from retail sales within the United States, if they are going to try to sell video game consoles and whatever that are made in China, tariffs on those video game consoles are likely to be significantly affected. And they have even said with the release of the new console of the Nintendo Switch 2 that pre orders have been delayed because of the tariffs themselves. Now, yesterday we had all the tariffs get rolled back except for the ones on China. So, what's going to happen to GameStop and where is this going to go? And what happens to people who are importing a lot of stuff in a post tariff economy that is what Trump has committed to over something like the next 2 years. Lucas, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the matter.
Well, one, I don't think a post-tariff or pre-tariff concept of what world trade looks like is true because we have already seen tariffs from other countries. And I think what is more at hand here and maybe more germane to GameStop's situation is the Trump administration's attempt to try to turn our economy to relying more on manufacturing and getting away from the fire sector of the economy. Now, GameStop gets very interesting in this part because one, GameStop does come from a background of manufacturing, of sales, not manufacturing, but of selling things that have been made, as you're talking about gaming consoles. But on the other hand, it has a it has a portfolio that has come to the door of becoming a financial or something that might look more like a financial institution. And
Well, I mean,
part
they definitely have been talking about GameStop being the next Berkshire Hathaway. They made changes to the company so that it can invest in things. Profits are way up. I don't know if you had a chance to look at their earnings, but like I think their earnings are like 131 million dollars, and last time it was something like 12. So they've something like 11x or 10x their revenues, and they have the ability to invest in whatever they want. And we covered this the other day where we said, well, it's probably likely that GameStop will buy Bitcoin. We were way in front of that one because we said this is what they probably should or will do, and then they came out and said they did it. So that happened, and we covered that I think weeks before GameStop actually bought Bitcoin. So they're definitely moving into some sort of a we're we're some kind of a financial firm or a hedge fund or something like that's what GameStop is shaping up to be.
and their position with Bitcoin also makes where they sit in the wake of the international politics that are going on today about global trade, about global commerce, makes it so very interesting. So they hold Bitcoin. The United States does not control Bitcoin. The United States may be trying to hold on to and purchase more Bitcoin so that it has a say, but you know there is that we're looking at an uncertain future in who sets the rules for global trade. And the United States has been in the catbird seat for a while with regards to being the place that companies or global corporations want to be headquartered at. And part of that is associated with the production and the rules that were set for dollars and global trade, because the world was using dollars for their global trade. That may change in the future, and it probably will change in the future. But again, going back to the tariffs, I think there were a couple of more things on that should be on our radar. You know, one thing that I thought was also, well, two things that I've found very interesting. I'll start with the one that maybe is a little bit shorter. and people may have noticed because it's been going on a little longer. And that is the discussions that the United States is having with Russia. Have you heard anything about sanctions?
I didn't hear anything about sanctions on Russia. I also didn't hear anything about any tariffs on Russia. Didn't they get excluded from the list? I thought there was some hullabaloo about that.
Well, they did get excluded from the list, and there's been no talk about the repealing of the sanctions of Russia. In part, I think that is because of the emergence of the BRICS network and the I mean, it's not that sanctions haven't had an effect on Russia, but because they've come up with alternatives, it's not something that we want to be bringing to a conversation about settling the conflict in Ukraine. So I would say that if you were to read the tea leaves from that conversation, you might say that the United States realizes the the diminishing effect that their sanctions have on the rest of the world. And so we have that in one hand. And then we turn and look at the discussions that are going on with the United States and Iran. And part of the solution that might be where Iran and the United States move to in the future has been put on the table by Iran. And this isn't a confirmed agreement, but the word is that Iran has been looking for investment in Iran from American companies because they look at the behavior of the United States in the past and say the only way for a security guarantee is to have investment by American companies. Because if American companies hold assets in various countries around the world, the United States is less disposed to go bombing those assets. So what we're looking at in the future between those two positions is a world that continues to have global corporations and global trade um, that doesn't rely on sanctions, and that the United States does not have the ability to set the rules or control those companies if we don't have sanctions or if they're not bound to the use of the dollar. So GameStop could be very interesting in what they decide to do in the future if they can't be forced into where they want to be based out of or what we want to see them do. Um, this is where I thought Bitcoin becomes a very interesting, not a golden parachute, but maybe a golden hang glider that allows companies to jump from country to country to find the best operating position for themselves in the world.
Well, and I think you're right about the internationalization of companies via using Bitcoin as a treasury mechanism, and these other payment systems. I totally agree with you. It's like we used to be able to enforce rules because we could exclude countries and companies and other players. We've got the OFAC list and a bunch of things that can be levied on individuals and wallets and bank accounts and what have you. So there's the ability to target pretty specifically whatever institution or individual that the government wanted to. But now that we have these other payment rails, we've got BRICS, we've got Bitcoin. There's less ability to do this kind of stuff. And if you look at some of the things that have happened in the headlines with GameStop recently, is they're closing a lot of stores. They're increasingly moving away from any stores which aren't very profitable. So if the retail store is doing well and it's in a favorable location or whatever, they're keeping it open, but they're closing whole swaths of these brick and mortar stores because they're not worth operating. And Ryan Cohen has been pretty aggressive doing this. So if you look at some of the things that they've been doing, they're selling a convertible note. It looks just like what MicroStrategy did. No surprise that there was that picture of Ryan Cohen and Michael Saylor together, where they're kind of shaking hands and buddying up, because Ryan Cohen has been listening to MicroStrategy and listening to Michael Saylor and saying, well, we're going to do the same kind of a thing. And they sold their convertible note almost immediately, and that immediately had a price impact. I think it went from something sub 20 to $29 based on what the convertible note was selling for. So they've definitely been moving in this direction. I wanted to note two other things that I think are notable before we kind of keep going on the conversation here. Is that we've got insiders that are purchasing GameStop, and this is pretty significant because usually you have companies and insiders are selling, not insiders are buying. Like even Nvidia, when Nvidia was seeing its tremendous run up, their CEO was selling. And what's been happening with GameStop is we've seen continuous buying from insiders. Larry Cheng and Ryan Cohen have both increase their positions in GameStop. They continue to double down on this being the investment that they want to be associated with, and putting more of their own treasure into the company. So this is pretty significant events with respect to GameStop that have happened in the last couple of weeks.
Well, I like to see the insiders of the company still still buying their stock and interested in where it's going, instead of trying to secretly divest themselves of it and looking for some sort of off ramp. So that's great to see. And I think the world of Ryan Cohen. I think what he did with Chewy was amazing. Um, I use a lot of Chewy, by the way, with my dear dogs. But there's also, so we've had this narrative of sort of global corporations and the fight between countries of the world and the global corporations in the past. But to go back to that Iran concept of the benefit that global corporations brings, and also to think about the other side of crypto from sort of the store of value Bitcoin aspect of it, and the liberty that it gives to companies to begin to think about where they want to be located. We can also think about the the avenues for insulation that crypto brings to them, and by that I'm talking about stable coins and currencies that are specific to that company. Because again, we think about these sanctions that the United States has placed on the rest of the world, and they have relied on the control of the money, of the monetary system that they were transacting in. So what happens whenever companies can begin to diversify the the currencies that they're trading in, and to even have their own proprietary currencies? And by that I think an interesting example is Huawei. Huawei, the Chinese electronics company that the United States basically kicked out of the United States. We extraordinarily indicted the CEO. We had Canada arrest the CEO of Huawei and and held her in detention for a while before releasing her and kicking Huawei out of the country. Um, Huawei is still in business and still making sophisticated electronic equipment. And I find what Huawei did with the country of Argentina very interesting. Argentina needed equipment that Huawei was making, but they didn't have dollars to pay for it, and they didn't have yuan to pay for it. And so instead, what they did was they said, "We have beef. Do you like beef? Do you eat beef? We'll pay you in beef." And Huawei provides a lot of equipment to the country of Argentina, and instead of paying in dollars or pesos or renminbi, they pay in beef. And I think that's what we could begin to see with a lot more corporations around the world.
Along with that topic, Lucas, it reminds me of the fact that last time we talked about this, I brought up that it'd be really nice for GameStop to start to invest in the microtransaction game of different economies within the cross-system platforms that they have. And I think that having a cryptocurrency and having the ability to back their own coin if they were to come out with it would be very beneficial for them in allowing them to pursue that uh, process. And then I also wanted to bring up that GameStop is in a unique position because a lot of the best games and a lot of the best things in the kind of whole economy of gaming that you think of, it's done outside of the United States. The United States is kind of notorious for being terrible for gaming, especially with the new woke culture that's becoming to be taken over. A lot of the better games are and better people creating the games are coming from outside of the United States.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with GameStop's relationships with the games that they have, but yes, they have a relationship with an industry that they can that they can export, the download. I think about Valve and Steam and where I don't know where they sit today, but I used to follow them as the Apple Store grew into prominence, and uh, the the sort of the the web background of of selling software grew, and you have a very an interesting opportunity that GameStop could be could be building on there. So I'm not sure what they do. Grant, you mentioned earlier that they're selling their brick and mortar, the actual GameStop stores. Is that something that they're doing broadly?
Yeah, it's been a trend, and this is a recent report that I pulled up here from this year, where they I've documented where they've shuttered thousands of stores, across the entire United States and globally, I think as well. So yeah, this has definitely been something they've been pursuing with some vengeance over a significant period of time.
And do you know if they owned those stores or were they renting those stores? Had that sort of avenue of private equity, fracturing of companies already occurred, in which they sold off all of the stores and rented them back from another
That was
entity?
actually what kicked off the whole GameStop saga to begin with, was that this retailer was targeted for one of these private equity destruction things, just the same way that Toys R Us and KB Toys and all the rest of these retailers had been destroyed by these private equity groups. GameStop was targeted for the same thing, and that's how this whole saga kicked off, was Ryan Cohen getting involved, fighting back, and saying, I'm not gonna allow this to happen to this company, and going to shed some light on what's occurred here. And that's also why the whole Bed Bath and Beyond got into the mix, because they got targeted for the same thing and got destroyed in similar fashion. So the fact that GameStop exists at all is because they fought back against that private equity takeover and internal destruction. As far as, do they own a lot of these stores, that is rare in the extreme for any retailer to own their building. Very few places do you have a standalone spot, because it's just not conducive. If you want to make a retail store, you usually want to be located to a lot of other retail stores, because when people go shopping, they're like, we'll stop by GameStop and then we'll go to Target and then we'll go to Barnes and Noble. At least that's how it was, in the 2000s or whatever. As things have increasingly become online, that doesn't make as much sense anymore. And I think that's why a lot of these stores get shuttered, is because there is no walk by traffic. There is no we'll make a shopping trip anymore. So it's rare, I think, in the extreme, to say that the building is owned. That was different for Red Lobster. Red Lobster, that's a standalone location. It's not dissimilar to like Pizza Hut or whatever. You actually go there, you go to that restaurant, and it does make some sense to have restaurant districts, and that's a very common thing. But these companies actually owned their buildings. Probably, I'd say Perkins is probably another one that owns their buildings. And so there was this idea that private equity could go in there, reach in, sell off all the assets, rent it back, and play a bunch of shenanigans and make money 6 ways to Sunday. I don't think GameStop is in any similar type of situation. They've done some reporting about what their disposition is around leases, and mostly, I believe GameStop is leasing space inside of outside malls, outdoor malls, indoor malls, and it's mostly lease spaces. So when they're closing these, I think it's because they're in a position where the lease has some break ability, they're past their lease, or they're coming up on a lease renewal and they're just not renewing the lease, and then they're closing the store down.
Well, as the Trump administration talks about focusing on Main Street and getting the economy way away from finance, insurance, and real estate. What we're talking about with this strategy that private equity was using was an understanding that to be renting real estate was a uh, was was a way that the economy was structured to was one of the sectors that is the biggest winner here, and that's because of the reliance on rising asset rates. Or the rising price of homes is true for the rising price of buildings, and to become an owner who was relying on rent and didn't have to be worried about where the money that somebody was paying the rent was coming from was an ideal position to be in. So as the Trump administration tries to turn us from that association with real estate, it'll be interesting to see what happens there. I could see GameStop not wanting to get caught to get caught waiting for political change in moving the focus of our economy to companies who could own their real estate, or to get it off of this inflation of real estate values. So, but it's that's what was going that for those who weren't who haven't been watching this. That's what was going on with so many companies that were publicly traded, was the ones that actually owned their the buildings that they were in. Those were ideal because they were bought not for the product they were making or the service that they were providing, but for the real estate that they held on to. And that's certainly true for Toys R Us, General Mills restaurants, all of those buildings. That was the prime target.
I think as we move forward and we start thinking about what does Bitcoin mean to the future state of companies, I think we're going to start to see some land grabs on the actual digital assets that companies hold. This has been something Michael Saylor's talked about, that buying Bitcoin right now is like buying real estate in Manhattan back, before there was a big boom in New York. I think that idea is likely to play out. The companies that are getting into Bitcoin in this day and age and are holding on to it as a treasury strategy will then become acquisition targets, not necessarily because they're a strong company, but just because they're holding some amount of Bitcoin. If we do see Bitcoin rise in price, something to the tune of 7xing where we're at right now, which many have said they expect to see that in the near term, that seems like a very likely thing. So that idea that you're buying a company not necessarily because of its future state profitability or because you believe it's going to grow, but rather because of the assets that it holds and what you can get by chopping it up into pieces because it's undervalued based on the assets that it's holding. I think Bitcoin is going to be less hidden though, because when you looked at companies, you had to dig through a bunch of documents and understand like what they were actually holding. And this is, I think, going to start increasingly being a line item on the balance sheet that just says we have 1,500 Bitcoins or something to that effect. And then you'll be able to say, well, they're an acquisition target just because we think we can buy that company, we will get the Bitcoin, and then we'll get whatever else, and we can chop the company up. But at bare minimum, like we'd be able to, harvest the Bitcoin out of the company, and that's a better way to acquire it.
Yeah, well, they've got the Bitcoin, and they also have a relationship that might mean in the future they are a marketplace for intellectual property gains, and those that are used electronically too. So I think that
Well, that
combination.
one has come specifically into question, and many investors have said that GameStop is poorly positioned in that world because if we move into a mostly IP dominated world of gaming, then that cuts GameStop out of the mix. Like they only can really exist if they're selling physical games. Like they don't really have a way to participate in the marketplace unless those marketplaces were done in a in a neutral way via NFTs or something to that effect. And we haven't seen any major game company adopt digital trading that's outside of their own walled garden. Like I can't think of one major company that said they embraced a public blockchain using some underlying structure like an NFT to allow for in-game items and trading. Like there was a lot of hype that would be the thing, but I think a lot of the gaming companies said, we already have an infrastructure for selling digital assets and we've already got in-game purchases. Like what would a public blockchain do other than take it out of our hands and make it so that it doesn't work? The only way that it would make any sense is if they had something like royalty enforcement. That's why everything that happened where we were looking at, do royalties actually work? Can they be enforced on chain was such a disheartening thing, because that could have been something that actually changed things and changed the game and changed the world for somebody like GameStop, because then they could have had a marketplace. But I think it's going to be hard for GameStop to play in that world when Nintendo, can easily capture all of that and not have to keep GameStop around at all because they don't need them. And that's what's happening with Steam. You can sell the Steam Deck, you can sell some of the Steam accessories, but once you have the deck itself, you're in the little Steam walled garden and there is no place for GameStop to exist. So that existential threat to what exactly is GameStop going to sell in a post-digital economy of the world of gaming has been something that many analysts have pointed at and said there's no future for GameStop because physical games aren't going to exist. There has been pushback from a lot of gamers saying, we don't like this digital thing because now I can't sell a used game. I feel like I'm being locked out and my assets can get rugged out from underneath me. That has not gone well for the gaming industry. And I think that is something that we're likely to see massive pushback from consumers. And if that's the case, then physical games are not going away. And even on the new console, the Nintendo Switch 2, we're still in a physical gaming world, but there is a lot of pressure on GameStop in the digital realm because there's a world where they just completely get shut out.
Well, what happens whenever GameStop takes a page out of Gene Hoffman's book and says, "Well, let's become a trust, and we'll register that that electronic game and put it on a blockchain and tokenize it," because I think that is where the world is moving. Period. And I think that GameStop again is well positioned. Sure, uh, Nintendo and other game manufacturers may think that they can keep people in their walled gardens and will have some sort of success to the extent of the sale of items in their games, but there is still a place. We're still going to see some sort of a marketplace or an exchange where people can have the greatest amount of variety and selection in the games that they're buying.
There's technical hurdles to that. A lot of the game consoles have been locked down in a way that if you try to do something like that, you'll brick the console. Like it requires the console to be rooted. I mean, the game consoles today, they're just selling computers that have a very particular form of digital rights management on them. And people have certainly removed those constraints. Like you can root your console. There's a lot of ways that you can install custom software on a PS5 or a Nintendo Switch. But a lot of the time, what that does is it locks you out of the online gaming arena. So if you want to play online games or you want to go to the Nintendo store and buy a digital game, if your console's been rooted or if it's been messed around with, they actively try to detect for that. And if they are, your machine can get bricked or you can get locked out of the digital economy. And so there's ramifications to that. So it's very less common to unlock a console first because it's technically challenging for the end user. It's even though they've made the tool somewhat easy in some cases, it's still inaccessible to most mortals. It isn't the kind of thing where you could just flip a switch and say, I want the DRM shut off and I want to do whatever I want and I want to trade games with my friends that have been digitally acquired. Like that's not easily done by a mortal, somebody who's not technically competent. And then second to that is there are ramifications to doing it that are very undesirable for a lot of users. So even if you know what you're doing, you might not want to do it just because you want to participate in those online arenas, or you want to be able to buy the digital games, and you don't want the negative stuff that will happen to your console or to your account because you did that.
Well, I recognize there are hurdles, but if we look at the music industry, they relied on digital rights management and for a while, but then they left that model and they went towards notions of streaming, and I think they also might arrive at something that looks more like looks like I don't know, blockchain, or the consumer actually owns the and can trade and sell the the uh, the electronic formats or whatever of the music that they bought. So I think that's something that consumers are going to move toward anytime they see companies providing or getting closer to that model. That's something that they all want. So and again, GameStop, like, things are changing in I don't know, the world trade establishment, the death of sanctions, the inability of countries to enforce those rules, or not inability, but a lessening of their power in enforcing that. We're not going to see global corporations be reduced in stature. They're going to be on more of an equal footing, and countries are going to be more limited in the power that they can exert on the market. So that's the world that we're moving into, and it may be threatening in some ways, but I think it's going to provide a lot of choice and variety for consumers. So and GameStop, again, I think very well positioned to make moves into realizing this next the next wave of global corporation.
All right. I think that's a good place to wrap. I didn't have anything else to say, so call it there.
Sounds good to me.
All right. We'll see you next time on FOMO.